Hello everyone and welcome back to the Little Quilter. Today we're going to do a bit of a different video. So you can see that I have my quilt finished behind me. This is the Barnstar quilt. I have been working on this for quite a while and I have finally finished it. It was quite the effort to get done and took a while. So it was originally purchased from Connecting Threads as a block of the month quilt kit, and I was supposed to complete it over like 9 months or something. It took me definitely longer than that to actually piece the quilt, and then it took me around almost 30 hours to quilt the actual quilt on my long arm. I did custom quilting over the entire quilt, and it was a learning process. This is only my third quilt, and I actually haven't measured it, but I will measure the quilt and tell you guys how long the quilt is. And so I think it's important with every quilt to look back at the quilt and think back on the quilt and sort of go over what were things that you really liked about this quilt, what were things that you hated about this quilt, what are things that you want to do different in the future. And so I love how this quilt turned out. I think it's really beautiful. I still have to do the binding on it, but overall I'm very happy with it. A couple of things that I did not like whenever I was quilting this quilt was changing the threads. And so, in fact, so much that I actually have it set for the next few quilts the same thread color for the entire quilt because I don't want to change the quilt thread. It was so difficult in some of these larger blocks back here because I would have to work in sections because I only have an 18-inch throat space, which actually gets smaller and smaller as you progress through the quilt. And so working in such small spaces and then having to go back and change the thread before I could roll the quilt up any further and going along the whole quilt, it was quite the process. Now, that being said, I think it looks gorgeous. I love the look of it, and the quilting is subtle and nice, but it is not overwhelming. You know, certainly having done like a red thread through all of this background back here would have been terrible. That would have been a terrible design choice. And I don't even think that using the cream thread through all of this red or really dark blue fabric would have been a good idea either. So I think at the end, the design choice was there. It was just something that potentially in the future I may work a little bit harder to find a thread that's going to blend throughout. Obviously, when there are super dark color changes such as this red, you may just have to change the thread and deal with it. You know, not every quilt is going to be as big as this quilt, so doing smaller quilts, you know, obviously lends to changing that thread color a little bit better. Other things that I like about this quilt are that all of the patterns are different, but they also repeat. So the fact that every green quilt block looks like this, so this quilt block looks like this quilt block down here, I like that. It helps to make it cohesive. So I would do that again if I had a sampler quilt that had repeating blocks. It allows you to make different design choices on each block, but pull it together by repeating that on those blocks. And it made it a lot of fun to quilt because every time I got to a new block, I got to do something different rather than just doing the same thing over and over again. So that is another thing that I really liked. Okay, so I have obviously pulled the quilt up so that you guys can see the border fabric here and the border design. I do like this design. I like the piano keys, you know, this rounded edge and then the curved wishbone design pattern in that semicircle. But what I would do in the future is really plan it out a little bit more because when I get to the edges on these, some of them I had to make the curve go all the way around and some of them actually end on the point. And to me, it's just not quite as finished as I would like. It doesn't look bad, you know, the quilt looks gorgeous and it's a minor detail that, you know, nobody's really going to take notice of. It's the border, it's not even, you know, it's the part that hangs off of the bed. But from the standpoint of designing in the future, I would like it to be symmetrical around the whole quilt. So that was a challenge for me. You know, even whenever I laid my rollers on there and marked the actual lines, when I went to quilt it, it changed on me. And so that's a part that I need to work on, is really being able to guide my quilting and plan my quilting in a way that it's going to be effective when I actually go to quilt it on my machine. So this was a part that, while I like the design, I wasn't as happy with the execution on the actual quilting of this Barnstar quilt. Okay, so the next part that I'm going to talk about that was definitely a challenge for me was the marked difference in color of the front of the quilt and the back of the quilt. Okay, so the back of the quilt is obviously this beautiful navy. It was the 108-inch wide backing in the same, I think it's the mercantile fabric line. Okay, but using such a dark blue background, I wanted my thread color to match the background, which is fine whenever you have a dark background on top. When you have a, a bright background on it, though, that's not always a good thing, right? So the issue was that using a navy blue thread on the back here is a problem whenever that pulls through to the top of the quilt. So I had to really be careful with my stitching and my tension on this quilt. And there are places on the front of this quilt that, if you look closely, you will see stipples. You will see little stipples of blue where it pulled through. I hand did my bobbins, and so because I hand did my bobbins, I'm not sure that the tension was exactly right. This is why on the next quilt, I'm going to try the Magna Glide bobbins pre-wound to see how does that change. The other thing that I'm going to really take into account in my future quilts, because wow, this is gorgeous, because it really is beautiful, and even looking at the back of this quilt in its own is really amazing, but the stress of dealing with the tension problems throughout the entire quilt was a big challenge for me. And so in the future, it may become more that I don't worry about the backing as much and use a thread color that is closer to a top color, so that I'm not worrying about are my stitches pulling through to the top, and you don't end up having this stress factor that just really doesn't need to be there, in all honesty. um, you know Maybe only worrying about one side of the quilt is a good idea. I hope that you guys enjoyed the Barnstar quilt and going through this entire process with me. And I hope that, as always, if you guys did, please remember to like, subscribe, give me a thumbs up, comment down below. And I look forward to sharing more quilting adventures with you guys in the future. Thanks.